All right. So we have only 4 attendees. It looks like one of those is an eduphoria here at the company. So it looks like we have 3 attendees here live. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to promote you all as co-hosts so that you can join in the conversation. Your participation will be completely up to you. If you're not in a place to be able to participate in the discussion, that's completely understandable and don't feel obligated. We just wanted to give you that option if you want to join in. We had some activities planned, like, Padlets and things that we could do asynchronously. But since we do have a small group, we thought we would, we would do that live instead. And so when you see yourself again promoted to co-host, you are welcome again to participate or not participate at whatever level you feel comfortable. But again, we just wanted you to offer that, to have that option. So.
And there won't be any cameras on, so you will be off camera. It will just be your ability to mute and unmute yourself to engage in the conversation. We're super excited to get to have this intimate conversation with you all. I hope you're comfortable engaging with us this afternoon so we can go a little deeper on some of these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a session that Tara and I have done a couple of times at conferences. And so we're happy to be able to offer it as a webinar this week. And we hope you feel comfortable participating, but we don't want you to feel obligated to participate.
So this afternoon, we're going to be going over some 3 kind of chunk topics. We're going to start with culturally responsive teaching and have some dialogue on what does that mean? How do we identify certain aspects of that? We will look at some components of data analysis, and this is an area where I know Jenny and I really come to life hearing from you all, kind of what is your focus? What are things you look at? What's important when you're assessing the culture in your district or at your campus, or looking at student performance, maybe through a unique lens. So we're excited to have this conversation with you today. And then we're going to talk about common classroom experiences. We've got this broken down into an activity that I really enjoyed doing with my campus staff whenever I was over school improvement. Part of that comprehensive needs assessment, one of the activities we would do is a what, so what, now what. So these topics are structured kind of in that, through that lens of what, so what, now what, really breaking down, identifying, going a little deeper, and then what can we do with this new knowledge that we've gained. So that's how we're going to structure our time with you this afternoon. So starting with the what, and starting to identify, what is our need here. So we're going to talk, as we discuss culturally responsive teaching, about the state of our students. We know that every single student is in a different starting point. We know that every teacher leading a classroom is in a different starting point. So we're all, engaging in this at different levels. One of the things I think about when I think about the state of our students was my first year teaching. I had the amazing opportunity to attend Capturing Kids' Hearts with the majority of my very, very small campus team. And one of my very impactful takeaways from that was finding ways to hear and listen to the students in my classroom about what goes on in their daily lives. So once I kind of had more knowledge and was able to facilitate a space for my students to share, it just really opened my eyes to my experience as a learner did not match the experience of my students in their learning journey. And I had to really listen and start to understand what impacted their daily lives and what I needed to do differently to support them so that they could connect with the things that I found valuable in our classroom shared experiences. And so that's one of the places my brain goes to when I think about the state of our students, and just initially, how do we start to uncover some of those layers so that we can become culturally responsive with our teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you'll notice here on the slide we were just on, we use the words opportunity gaps, which we're going to talk about a little more later in depth. I think it's a good kind of shift in terminology and shift in thinking when we were thinking about student achievement and gaps that can kind of go along with that. So we'll discuss that later. But on this next slide, when we address culturally responsive teaching, we're really talking about recognizing a student's lived lives and kind of having teachers make those connections between a student's lived life, so life at home, personal experiences, and then what's happening in the classroom. So we know that two things happen when we do that. We have that cognitive connection. There's a file in the student's brain where that information belongs because they can relate it to something that they've experienced in their personal lives. And then the second thing that happens is that we actually foster an emotional connection with a student when that happens. And so when they can relate on a personal level to something that we're providing in our instruction, not only do we process it better cognitively, but also they process it emotionally, and it allows that really kind of deeper level connection and relationship building among a student and their peers, and then also the student and their teacher. And so really, really important to start bringing, the personal experiences of your students in the classroom and allow them to connect, allow teachers and other students to connect to students where they're at, not necessarily where we think they should be or where we're at with the information. Anything you want to add to that, Tara?
No, I think this is the first chance we kind of want to take and pause and make this a broader conversation and hear from you all around that question that you see at the bottom of the slide. How do you bring the lives and experiences of your students into the classroom? So if you are comfortable, we would love for you to unmute yourself and maybe share some of the tangible ways that this is occurring in classrooms at your campus or at your district, or maybe things you did when you were in the classroom if you were not currently in the classroom. And I'll share one example from my Capturing Kids' Hearts. One of the strategies that I took away was my bell ringers that we already had a routine of doing on a daily basis, that a minimum of 2 times a week, those had to be about some type of personal engagement. So instead of being about content, what did you learn yesterday? It became about, hey, how is this going in your life? Or what's an experience you would like to share with me, something you want me to know about you as either a student or as a scientist or as a sibling. So that was one way that I was able to use a routine in my classroom and find a way to connect on a deeper level with students. And by having those bell ringers twice a week be about their personal lives instead of about the content of my classroom.
Right, absolutely. And my mind kind of goes to, what is a less regular practice where, your campus sets up an appreciation week and kids bring, something they cooked at home that's relative to their, traditions at home. And, I think our goal in this webinar is to take a step away from that and say, this can happen every day in real ways. It doesn't have to be a week that's set aside in your year where you do that. It doesn't have to be a big special occasion. Those things are all great, but, there's this kind of real practical way that this can be done daily in the classroom. So again, like Tara mentioned, maybe it's just having a conversation with a kid about how things are going in their life. Maybe it's when you are introducing new material, you allow students to provide you with examples of how this relates to their life. So rather than, us sort of creating this scenario where that happens, that this becomes part of your regular practice.
So one of the things we wanted to talk about was just recognizing that starting point. And a lot of the reading and research that I do around culture, around leadership, or I'm sure we've all encountered the mega super analysis of John Hattie. One of the themes I continuously come across is that collective teacher efficacy. I was recently asked by a colleague about what's something I think would make a vast improvement for schools just on a general spectrum. And I truly believe that us engaging as leaders at all levels. So whoever you are on the campus, at the district, even if you're that student, you have the potential to be a leader for those around you. Um, and I have found, looking at this list of possible situations that you might find yourself in, being a first year department head, or you've transferred schools, or you have new leadership, that formal leadership, that your administration has changed. I've found that when I'm in these different spaces and I have that guidance to move in the same direction as my peers, I have defined goals, I can feel confident in the progress I'm making and in the progress that's happening around me. But when I don't have that same guidance, when I'm not clear on the goals for my campus or for my classroom, I start to feel a little bit of anxiety and I'm not as confident in the decisions I'm making because I don't know the direction I'm headed. So I just wanted to provide a little context for thinking through what is the impact of that leadership when we do or don't know the direction we're headed and something in our situation changes. Because we know things are changing for our students on a pretty routine basis, especially this year. Are we a remote learner? Are we back face to face? If I make a change, do I keep the same teacher? And what are all these situations that are impacting us? And how can we help minimize the stressful moments of there by having that guidance?
Right. Absolutely. I think we've all, this year has been a little traumatic for everybody, and embracing again people where they are and making sure that the goals are clear, or the pathway to success is clear for both our teachers, if you're, a campus principal, as well as, that the teachers are making those things clear to their students, because they are obviously experiencing the same sort of anxiety that we are with the ever changing state of our schools from day to day. So, yeah. So this next slide, Tara and I actually participated in a remote learning course at Harvard this year. And I really appreciated this slide. It's a little bit, when you first look at it, you're like, that's a lot of words. But when you really dig into what those things are and you talk about learner and learning centered community of inquiry, how are you addressing that? Is your classroom or is your campus, sort of formed around that social presence? Is it very teacher centered? Is it a teaching present, or are you challenging kids cognitively? Do they get their sort of those heartfelt moments from being challenged cognitively through their academics? And you take those three and you stick them in a Venn diagram and you say, where do they overlap? And that dotted circle was added later to this diagram. And you realize that, if you're challenging kids in all three ways, socially, cognitively, and, through that teaching presence, then, you can easily encompass context of cultures, passions, backgrounds, preferences, and needs. And when you do that, you sort of heighten that engagement to the next level. And therefore, you're heightening that academic potential, that social and emotional wellness potential, sort of to that next level. And so again, it's a little bit of an eye crosser when you first look at it. But then when you really dig into what these words mean, it makes a lot of sense. And so we included this diagram simply because I think it's a great place to start when you're sharing this conversation with people in your district.
Yes, this can definitely be a wonderful kind of way to set a foundation and engage in an initial conversation of what is my impact when I talk to my learners, what happens as we engage with these scholars on our campus. So I love this diagram, as a launching point to kind of uncover and discover different ways of doing things. So we have done a little bit of defining our what, but looking at the state of our students, understanding that we all start in a different place, starting to define that culturally responsive teaching and what does that mean within our context. So now what we want to start to think about how this relates in our current situation. So wherever you are, your position at this point in time, that's what we want to start thinking about now. So we took some time to craft a problem statement. What really are we trying to uncover through this conversation? We already brought up a little bit about the opportunity gap. So we started thinking, how often do we discuss the achievement gap? And how often, how masterful are we at measuring that achievement gap? But is that really what we're trying to solve? Or is that just a symptom of the larger problem, which is that opportunity gap that we're starting in different places, but we don't always recognize that starting point before we move on, before we start making those transitions towards our academic goals. And so we really wanted to pause here and think, okay, if the achievement gap is a symptom and the opportunity gap is the problem, then measuring student achievement does not address the core issues facing students. As we go through the so what section, this is where we're going to start to talk about data analysis and really kind of drill down, how do we look at data differently to uncover why one student performs a different way than another student, or why, if we start to look at different groups of students, because we know with our state accountability, that's one of the expectations of our systems, that we grow our students that represent different demographics to meet certain goals. And so we have to have a way of digging into our data and understanding, why do these discrepancies even exist? And that might be different for a school in North Texas versus a school on the coast. What is leading to those opportunity gaps? So we really want to have you reflect within your own context of why those opportunity gaps might exist for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the shift in language here. When you're identifying achievement gaps, it tends to be student centered. You're looking at what students, failed to reach certain measures. And when you identify that an achievement gap is actually just a symptom of an opportunity gap, I think it shifts the onus back away from the students and back onto the educators, the professionals in the space, the adults in the space. It's not, a failure on the part of a student to achieve. It's issues with, where our instruction or our analysis is falling short. And are we offering all kids an equal opportunity to achieve? And so that's, I love the shift in language away from achievement gap and towards opportunity gap when you're looking at data. And we use words like achievement gap and subpop and those kind of things in our language because that's the way the information has been presented to us and the way we've been presenting it for years. And we slip into those words without thinking of what the real impact is for that type of language. But when you get to the heart of it, if you're a brand new teacher sitting in a space and you hear these words, maybe your gut feeling is a little different than a teacher or an educator who's been sitting in the space for 20 years hearing the words. We kind of become numb to those subtle impacts of the way we use these words. And I think it's just kind of important to recognize that words have meaning and the way we present them has meaning, and that we can actually, we can actually sort of shift the responsibility of learning to the kid, by using something like achievement gap, when the responsibility should be shifted back to the professionals and the educators by using the word opportunity gap.
So as part of this, I collected some samples of campus and district goals that might look familiar to you. Some of them are written from that first person perspective. And so I just wanted to think about these goals. One, do these feel relatable to you? Have you had goals like this in the past? And what are some things that you might notice that are similar between these? Some things that stood out to me was a strong emphasis on students and measuring achievement. So once we start to make these goals measurable, what are we going to uncover if we go deeper than just the surface level of meeting this goal? What are the actions going to be that are going to help us meet these expectations? And then we're about to dig into some data. What data is going to be necessary to meet these goals? And once we identify those pieces of data, how do we analyze that data and make it into identifiable action steps? So there's a lot of layers to uncover when we have a goal, the face value of that goal. What does it mean when we meet that goal? What are the things we had to do to get there? And how are we going to continue pursuing that level of growth for our systems that we can continue making this type of impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we look at, we use aware to look at assessment data and analysis, and again, identify gaps in our instruction, places that we could provide additional support for students. We kind of use that as a traditional intervention tool. Here we are, this is where we are today, here's where we need to be. And we really need to think about, yeah, we have the information. We're really good in school districts at looking at the information. I think we get hung up a little bit on what do we do with that information once we have it. And what systems are in place in your district to support teachers in relationship building with schools, and identifying and connecting to students in their lived lives. So, what processes do we have in place once we've sort of identified the problem? What processes do we have in place to sort of meet those goals to solve that problem? And where do we offer feedback for teachers who maybe need additional support in this area? What do we do to recognize teachers that that are doing really well in this area, and set those people up as examples on your campus or in your district? So how do we actually implement the solutions to the problem? So again, I think we're really, really adept at identifying problems. We fall a little short sometimes on the solution phase, and that's true in people's personal lives as well. It's true in my personal life. And so I think when you're talking about in a system, you have to have those kind of checks and balances to keep people on the right track. I don't know any one educator who would say, I don't value relationship with students. I don't care if I'm meeting the needs of every student. I don't care if all of my students are performing on the same level. Teachers kind of unanimously and educators unanimously value those things. So it's not a question of buy-in. The buy-in is there. It's what are we doing to help them get there? And what are we doing to support them once they're there?
Yeah, so we wanted to take another opportunity to pause and hear from you if you would like to share. One of the things that we really believe here at eduphoria, Jenny and I are part of an assessment literacy team, and we spend a lot of time talking about words and what those words mean, including the word aware. How does what we provide help you be aware of the students that are in your classroom? And one of the core beliefs that we have on our assessment literacy team is the teacher is the most qualified individual to make conclusions about student performance. So I'd like to pose those questions that Jenny just went through. What are some ways in your position that you're supporting teachers? And when I say your position, that might mean like your title, or it might just be where you find yourself in space and time right now on a campus, at a district. How are teachers supported in making these types of conclusions about student performance?
Do we have any sharers?
Sure, I'll share.
Perfect. Thank you, Monica.
Sure. So, we talk about a preponderance of evidence, right? And I think about it when you go to the doctor's office,
Mm-hmm.
you have symptoms and then you have tests that you run, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's the same way when kids come in the classroom. You have behaviors and instances within the classroom, and then you have this preponderance of evidence. And so one of the features that you guys added not that long ago, I think it was this last year or whatever, about teachers being able to edit and build historical views of students using the data.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a critical piece, but I also think I'm in the continuous improvement mode always. Mm-hmm. And so in looking at, we just got done drafting our 21-22 DIP, and then we did a training yesterday, follow up on CNA and with the CIP, and then department plans and the whole bit. But data, we're finding, well, research has already supported this, and we have things in place, but what we're finding is we're having to revisit that conversation about data all the time. And so it's reframing that conversation. And I think it's even more critical right now because of where kids are at and a loss of learning, or whatever you want to call it, right? There's different scholars are calling it different things. But I think this is a critical piece. And so we do, from our department stance, we do training, whether it's virtual or face-to-face. We just set all of our summer PD. We have We implemented a Canvas assessment course this year. So if you don't want face-to-face or synchronous, you can log in there and do it on your own at your own time. We're constantly pushing out like the webinars that you guys have, the recordings that are posted on YouTube. So I think it's just a constant conversation and making sure people understand all of the data points. For example, one of the tools we looked at that we utilize for RTI, when at first glance, overarching, the children looked okay, right? They were hitting in tier 1. The problem is they were hitting at the end of tier 1.
Mm-hmm.
And so unless they dug in deeper and could see, oh, this kid actually has an issue with comprehension, and the other subcategories are kind of blocking that, because the average rolling up makes you look green per se, that you're tier 1. And so really getting people to dig deeper into these data points to understand holistically how the child is doing. So that's what we do. And again, we're a department of 5. We have an admin assistant, we have a data person, we have a DTC, and then we have a brand new coordinator of continuous improvement in conjunction with myself. So we're constantly trying to revisit these conversations and how they flow throughout the campus, all the way to the teacher, interventionist, even EAs. I mean, we have EAs on these trainings as well. Anybody we can get to listen, we are trying to have these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's really important that you just said that. So when we kind of look at, and this is a little off topic, but you mentioned, your EAs are part of that conversation. It's anybody who has contact with the student. When you're talking about social and emotional health and building relationships with kids in schools, that's your bus drivers, it's your cafeteria ladies, it's your janitors, it's your secretary in the front office, your school nurses, it's everybody who can have this impact. And so anybody who comes in contact with students can make a difference. And I think, sometimes we think, well, it's teacher centered, teachers are the ones, and that, but really I think it goes broader than that for sure. And I love, Monica, that you said you're constantly revisiting the data conversation and looking for ways to take a deeper dive or a more in-depth look and gather more information about it, because that's where it's at. It's not just, okay, here's the assessment, this is how we did, let's move on. We've got, these 3 programs for, kiddos. It's really taking that, second and deeper look that gets you where you need to be for sure. So I appreciate you sharing. I know y'all do a great job there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your examples and also giving us a little context of what, who is contributing to leading those conversations at your district. That I think will be helpful for many people who come back and get to experience this webinar after the fact. So we are going to hop into the software for a brief moment to look at a couple versions of a data view. So I love, Monica, that you brought up teachers having that edit button, and that's something that is so powerful to have in the hands of each of our teachers, so they can really start to look at their data in unique ways that help them make sense of what they need to do instructionally to support their students. So this link just takes you to an article in our online help guide. If you are unfamiliar with editing data views, that will give you some background information there. And we are going to look at 2 examples. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit for the sake of your eyes. Here is some sample data that was collected. Usually we see a lot more information down here on the left, but in this case, we have a campus that knows they have a high population of students that have been identified as English language learners, and they really want to help to bridge that opportunity gap for these students. And one that starts with identifying where do we see gaps in that performance. So this teacher has chosen to go through with one of her local assessments. This could have been a teacher test, maybe it was a unit assessment, a campus assessment, and she wanted to just look at, compared to all students, how did these students that she's really focusing in on with instructional strategies for this group that can be applied to all of her students, and what is she seeing there are some differences. So some things that she's noticing are that on certain questions, students are performing at a lower rate than the whole group of students. So this can be some things to look at within instruction. It could be some things to look at with that assessment itself. So this is a really good starting point for this teacher to begin asking some questions about her instructional practices, about how students engage with the actual content of the assessment. And this can be such a powerful tool for her to bring back to her colleagues that teach the same thing or something similar, or work with the same groups of students and say, hey, are you making the same discoveries that I'm making when you provide a constructive response to this group of students? Are they performing, at the same level as other students, or is there some type of gap that we need to start to uncover what is actually leading to us collecting data that looks this way? So this is one example of making that type of comparison to start asking those questions and digging a little deeper.
Right. And these, views, again, we've provided the link there. If you've not built those views you have the ability to filter specific demographics of students for that sort of deeper dive into their performance, to kind of look at, again, gaps in the instruction that may help address the needs of those students. My son is dyslexic, and before I was even living in the education world, I took training classes at NIHouse to kind of help him, move forward in his educational needs. I knew his needs were different. And really what I learned through all of that is that best practice for a kid who's dyslexic, or even best practice for a kid who is a LEP, is often best practice for everybody. And so it's not that you have to do something different for these kids. It's that you change little things in your instructions for all your students, which can lead to higher performance, with students who maybe fall into a demographic, such as dyslexia or 504 or LEP. And so again, you're not reinventing the wheel with your instruction. You're just making subtle changes that makes a difference in these kids' lives. So
definitely. Thanks for that context. It's so true that when we know best practice, and sometimes that best practice is identified for a certain group, we know it's something that can be applied for all of our students, whether they have a small or large identified need. So here's a second example of the same type of data view, but this time we are looking at all students as well as students by gender. This can be something that is helpful for our CTE courses. We know some of the data that's collected for our campuses and districts is, do we have students enrolling in courses that are traditional or non-traditional based on their gender? And so this could be something that's beneficial to look at in those cases. So a lot of times this is relevant to our CTE courses. So things like ag, not only do we have high female enrollment, but then what does it look like when our students are performing these tasks? Are they reaching the same levels? Is something about our instruction creating a barrier that's not allowing certain students to perform at the same level as others? So I just wanted to give you kind of two different contexts for how you might start to look at data and what types of questions that might help you to ask within your position, your role at your campus or district.
Yeah. And so we're going to kind of move back into that vocabulary piece. And as Tara mentioned before, the achievement gap is a symptom of the opportunity gap, which is the illness, right? Essentially, if you use Monica's doctor analogy, it's absolutely the same thing. And so, instead of sort of treating the achievement gap, let's focus on the opportunity gap and treat that. And certainly data analysis can help us do that. And here, at eduphoria, we really, our world is built around, that assessment data piece, but there's other data pieces too that really have to be considered. So attendance data, discipline data, do I have, a lot of times we see those things happen first before we see that drop in, academic performance. And so are we meeting their social and emotional needs? Do kids want to come to school? Are they happy to be there? When they're there, are, they being singled out for discipline? And so I think thinking about sort of that whole picture of the whole child is so important when you're having this conversation. And this particular slide, where your focus is in this discrepancy. And so, identifying the discrepancy helps us get started, between what we want for all of our students, where some students actually are. The discrepancy is where that opportunity gap lives. And so again, moving our data conversation into that discrepancy place is how you start to solve that problem.
Okay, so now transitioning to now what? So we have provided some definitions. We've dug a little into data and what are questions we can ask, what are things that we can start to measure, and then how is that going to impact the things we're doing on a daily basis? So we want to talk about how do we begin to address those opportunity gaps within our instruction and assessment. And really our conversation is going to lean more into that conversation around instruction. And we're going to talk about what you saw in our title, having shared classroom experiences. And so we know that if students are coming to us, with varied layers and lenses to look through, we need to create some shared experiences for them within our classroom. Jenny and I were both former science teachers, so we definitely understand the value of that hands-on learning, providing those enrichment opportunities, and just really approach things with that inquiry model. Like, here's some things. What are some questions you would ask? What are some ways you would manipulate this, put it together, break it down? So we really have a lot of that context to bring to this conversation of saying, this is something that none of our students have encountered, and how do we want them to engage with these materials, with this topic? And then we all have this shared experience together. I know I got to mentor a teacher who was a master at this. He would walk around the classroom and be like, I don't know. You're going to have to explore this. You're going to have to figure it out. And he would just, play the role of, I can't provide you the information. I need you to bring me information, and then we can problem solve together. And that was always a really fun experience to watch when he did those inquiry models with his students.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I like this quote. I pulled it. It was an anonymous quote, so we couldn't cite the source, but a lesson is taught and experience is experienced. And I think, again, having come from that science background, you foster the situations where you create experiences for kids that are shared all the time. But I think it can be done cross-curricular. You can even use your science lab that you're doing in fifth grade science for fifth grade math instruction. As an example, if your fifth grade math teacher knows what's happening in, your fifth grade science lab, then that is a point of reference for your math teacher to use. So she knows that kids have experienced, units of measurement in science, and so she can draw on that. So rather than coming at it from a hypothetical standpoint or a theoretical standpoint that you're assuming kids kind of have some background knowledge, the fact that they've experienced it personally is important. And so there's kind of two ways to address the experience thing. It's drawing on their personal experience lived in their lives and tying those into classroom activities that kind of fosters, again, that cultural and emotional connection with a student. But it's also, creating those opportunities for shared experiences. And, one of the things that, you can struggle with as a teacher, I think, is making sure that any kind of reference point that you use is universal for your kids. If you're going to reference, say a television show, you can't assume that everyone in the class has seen that show. Show that clip, create that common experience before you, share that example in your classroom. Same with, music or shopping. I taught kids who literally had never been to a mall. They had no context for what a mall would be like, or online shopping, what an online shopping opportunity. So things that I maybe would take for granted that people would know what a mall was, or what, shopping online in Deep East Texas, where you were 2 hours from a mall, there were kids who had never been to a mall, and so again, it's creating that experience together. So, maybe it's showing a clip from a movie where people are shopping at a mall to give that context, or maybe it's, going online and buying lab supplies with your students, making that purchase online, involving your students, and calculating cost and whatnot, creating that experience with your kiddos so that you have those sort of shared experiences to use examples as a classroom instead of assuming. Baking was another one. In science, I use baking references all the time, kind of assuming that people had baked chocolate chip cookies, right? There are kids who have not baked chocolate chip cookies. And so, maybe having a student bake chocolate chip cookies at home and video that, and then bring them to school to share with the students, or maybe me videoing myself, provides, again, that context for those conversations and for lessons to be built around that are common to all students, because you've fostered that, you've set that up, rather than assuming.
And one of the layers here is building that vertical professional learning community. If, as a sixth grade teacher, we generated this experience in our math class, how can next year's teacher build upon that and say, hey, remember when you did this in Miss Jenny's class? We're going to continue learning about that today. Who can share about what they remember from that experience? Because we recognize there might be students that weren't in Miss Jenny's class, or there might be students that were in a different district last year. So we still need to create a little bit of context, but how much can we build and how much time can we save if we're using the experiences that we know our team members have already generated with our students? So that's another powerful layer here, is just how, as the adults within this building, are we working with one another to create those opportunities for students as kind of a cohesive track for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, creating a shared experience for a student can be costly financially. It can be costly, in time. And so getting the most bang for your buck for that involves communicating across teams. Again, if your math teacher and science teacher know what they're doing, they can draw on the experience that one of the other teacher has creating without having to recreate that experience themselves. And so again, on the next slide, we'll kind of look at different examples of the word volume. So, there are various uses of the words for volume in an instructional setting. And so, is it too loud? Can you calculate it? Is there a formula for it? So if you're looking at it in a science classroom, or a math classroom, you may be using that formula. If you're looking at it, from a science classroom, you're probably saying, how much space does it take up? So how, could we create a cross-curricular experience that captures volume in all three of these contexts that can be shared across all three instructional areas? And so we'd love to hear, again, in your district, if you're doing any of this kind of vertical work or horizontal work with creating experiences or sharing references. We'd love to hear about what you're doing in your district to do that. So if anyone wants to share.
And I'd like to share a little bit about my own experience directly with studying volume. This was always a fun topic for my students. I knew they had prior exposure to it, but I didn't always know what that prior exposure looked like. So we would take time and we would make whipped cream in class, and we would look at how much space did the cream take up on its own. And now that we've whipped it, how much space does it take up now? And then we'd move into doing some calculations. And I thought it was super interesting when Jenny and I were just kind of organically trying to come up with what would be a good example, to show all these different ways of connecting with this one term. I hadn't even thought of volume being about if it's too loud, which is going to be super, super relevant in our fine arts courses. That's something they have specific words for how loud to be when you are in band playing your instrument to make sure everyone can be heard, or to provide some type of dramatic effect in the piece that you're performing. So this was a really fun example to kind of come up with and figure out what are all the different ways that a student might be learning about this term volume, and how are they expected to engage with this as they're moving through the building from class to class. I found this to be super interesting and insightful to talk about from all these different lenses.
Yeah, and my mind kind of goes to the English language learner thing we talked about earlier. So, providing the context to an English language learner for the different uses of the word volume, right? One of the things we hear from English language learners is that one word has multiple uses, which is not necessarily true in their native language. And so, again, when you're providing that context to an English language learner, that's no different for a native English speaker, right? Providing the context for the 3 or 4 different meanings for that word. So academic vocabulary is academic vocabulary for everybody. And again, creating experience that support learning academic vocabulary is also appropriate is equally or as important for your, English language learners as it would be for your, native English speakers.
Yeah, so as we wrap up our conversation, we really want to leave you with these thoughts about how are these connections being made for your students, or if you are directly leading teachers, how are you helping them build connections across how they're engaged with their students or their own experiences as a student and how they might use some of that, adjust some of those things from their own experience to create these new contexts for students. And so we really want you to think about how can you create shared classroom experiences, whether that's doing that for a group of 8th graders or a group of first-year teachers or a group of new department heads that have been teaching for 20 plus years. And then how do you connect them with those cross-cultural references? How do we maybe take strategies from other industries and use those within the realm of our education setting? And so there's lots of ways that we can make these connections, not just with our teachers and students, even though that's the majority, the emphasis of our conversation today. But there's also lots of ways that we can embark on this kind of discovery and conversation around this topic with our teachers, with our formal leaders through our administration as well.
Yeah, everybody has kind of experienced that whole thing where you're sitting in some professional development course or seminar, and they say something that you've experienced personally, and you have that sort of immediate connection to the content. And you know that at that kind of moment where the light bulb goes off for you came when you could relate to what they were saying. And so whether the information that they're providing is brand new to you or is familiar to you, but maybe at another level or a deeper context, like that light bulb moment usually happens when they say something, they're like, oh yeah, I know what they're talking about. And so it's the same for our kids. And so whether we're doing this in the classroom or we're doing it as part of our PD, again, kind of creating common experiences and making those connections across different types of PD, so if you're doing this particular presentation or webinar in a context of social and emotional or whole child conversation, it's still the same conversation and it can happen in both places, which is a great opportunity for that sort of cross curricular connection with professional development.
So we are so glad that you were able to join us this afternoon. If you have any questions or just would like to engage in some follow-up conversation on this topic or think through things that your district is doing, how you're using data, Jenny and I would definitely love to hear from you. You can contact us at training@eduphoria.net. We would feel very honored to continue this conversation with you in the context of your district or your campus and hear what you have going on. What are your questions about how to be more culturally responsive in your teaching practices?
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you guys for being here today.